Benedikt is a recent portrait commission, so I've decided to ask my clients about some of their thoughts on the creative process.
What I really wanted and expected out of the experience was a kind of creative conversation, a little bit of input on both sides of how do you think this is going, what might this look like, how about this idea, what sort of shape might this take. So what I really hoped for was someone to kind of help me drill down all these ideas into something that is produced at the end. Rather than me come out with all these wonderful ideas because I have this massive idea of who you are as a person, and then a creative person coming in and saying, here's my perspective that I think we can represent in a piece of artwork. That's what I expected, and that's definitely how I experienced the process.
You get a bit of an idea given to you about what portraiture and what artists are going to be like when they're doing this kind of piece. And it was really interesting to see that collaboration, see the technical process. I think you can see that in the finished piece, that with the use of colour and layering, you can see the process within the piece itself, and that's something I found really, really interesting.
The best way I've been able to sum it up, at least myself, was actually in the final painting, and it was these kind of two levels of reality in the same painting. The stylized kind of almost pop art in Malta at the top out the windows, and then this much more realistic, impressionistic view inside the flat. That to me is why I wanted a representation of Benedikt that wasn't a photograph, because I didn't want something that portrayed, and I know photography doesn't always do this, but portrayed reality fully or even partially. I wanted something that portrayed your personality. I wanted something that caught a perspective of you through a prism of Mark's training and his artistic inclinations and our input and who we are as people and how that all came together. That creative process, I think all those moving parts can't really be achieved in the same way with photography. It would just be a much different end product and process. That's why it was so important to me.
Photography has a different kind of place. It has a place which achieves a different kind of result as to what we were looking for. I think with portraiture you get a certain level of versatility, both in sort of the medium and things like, and as he says, the different styles that you can exhibit on a canvas. I think that's something that we were looking for, that stylistic difference, that move away from such a literal interpretation that somebody gets from photography to something a little bit more representative, something a little bit more ethereal maybe.
One of the things that's made a big, for want of a better word, impression on me is the Scottish Impressionist style. Because I love that the colour schemes and things all feel like walking through heather. But I also really appreciate lots of that kind of European Renaissance style, the almost hyper-realism. And I think Mark was just a kind of perfect blend of those two styles. So the final piece to me feels very Scottish Impressionist in a very traditional Italian Renaissance style, which is not something I've seen before, but it's something that I really, really love. Mark was just a perfect choice for that. There are plenty of really excellent portrait painters in Scotland, but they all offer unique perspectives, and this was the one that was closest to what I really valued in artwork.
We're looking for something that was at the same time timeless, but also had a clear link and was clearly from a time and a period, and representative of where we were, where we lived geographically, and also the period that we live in. And I think in this piece, in this style, as you say, you've got a lovely combination of Scottish influences and European influences and technical skill all combining to this unique style, which is something that we were wanting to go for. it'd be a wonderful thing for us if we ever do move away from Scotland or wherever we go in the world, we'll have this representation of where we were living at that time in our lives. So when we're thinking about what a portrait is and what a portrait wants to communicate, you can have something that purely depicts a person's face and what they look like at that point in their life, or you can look to something that's more representative of where they have been and maybe where they're going and sort of their history, family history. They're inspired by sort of old Tudor portraiture, which took a sort of biographical approach to representations of a person, not just their appearance, but also who they are, what things they've done in their life, education they've had, where they were born, things like that. So you can see it in this portrait with the presence of certain artifacts and the background, things like that. I think that's what we were wanting to communicate, something beyond just an appearance of a person, but a sort of a riddle hidden within the painting of what that person is.
When I actually saw this representation of Benedikt in this beautiful and unique way that was absolutely fascinating and detailed and aesthetically beautiful, I just couldn't stop finding things and I couldn't stop looking. It was everything for me. It was fascinating how many aspects of your personality that it could be represented on a board with some oil paints. It seems so transcendental or something.
I think the process can be a really interesting thing, even from the client's point of view, where you're in the dark for long periods of time and you have time to think about what you might behold at the end of the whole period. When I first saw it, it was a totally new experience. Somebody sees photographs of themselves, but what you don't see is something that somebody has spent a long period of time deciding what to include, what not to include about a person's appearance and about the setting that they decided to put themselves in for this portrait. And I think once I'd gotten over the experience of seeing myself and understanding all the different aspects of the portrait that I'd chosen to include, I started to try to look at it from the perspective of somebody who didn't know me and hasn't been involved in the whole process, to try and look at things, what would somebody pick up on if it weren't me looking at it, because I think that is a very interesting idea. Close friends were gobsmacked and interested to see a portrait of their close friend. They recognised it definitely as very representative of me, which I hope is a good thing.
What I found really interesting, almost like a fly on the wall observing you talking to our friends about how you looked in the portrait, was how many different aspects of you they hadn't picked up on before the portrait was done. So people would kind of go, I never realised that about Benedikt. I never realised simple things like I never realised he sits in this really particular way. And people didn't realise there was such specificity in how a person is based on temperature and mood and climate and everything, the clothes you're wearing. How people then went on to say, I've now found out more about Benedikt's personality because I've been given this perspective, this prism, the artist's prism almost, to look through myself and see my friend and all these different ways that they present and ways that you talk and interact and your history, family history is all there and the places that you chose to depict. You've really shown people what's important.
I think when people are first seeing the painting and they're trying to read it and trying to see what kind of symbolism they can read within the painting, people who know it and particularly find certain aspects of it immediately recognisable. Family members will immediately recognise the scene in the background. They'll recognise the beer bottle, they'll recognise certain things that are immediately people can immediately pick up upon. The way that the portrait has been staged and the way that the portrait has been created draws the viewer's attention to certain aspects that would that would cause them to assume there is some sort of symbolism within those objects, and to go, well, what's that, and what can I read into that, and or why is it? I think everything that's within the composition has clearly been specifically chosen to be there. Nothing's been added for no particular reason. There's no fluff to any of the things that have been added.
Everything that Mark's chosen to include in the painting are in some way important to us. Everything from the floor and the windows of our first flat together, and the first table that we bought together, and all the objects with lots and lots of symbolism for us. But what I really appreciate about this, as I do with any piece of artwork in a gallery that really stands out to people before they see the provenance, is that the composition means something before you know its meaning. So with this piece, this composition creates a mood. There's a certain set of items that create a feeling. I think that the champagne bottle and the candles and the book, it kind of creates an ambience of after a dinner party, or chatting over some ideas with a glass of wine in front of some lovely bright windows. It creates a mood and a feeling in someone, even if they don't know how important those things all are to us. And then once they do know that, once they've read the short blurb next to it or something like that, they've heard the spiel from us, then they get to see a whole nother dimension to that composition, which is, I think, another wonderful kind of multi-layered part of a portrait, rather than, I don't know how that would be done in photography and things, but this is, to me, a very direct way to represent so many levels of a person and their presentation, their character, their personality.